The Travel Show, sponsored by Turkish Airlines.
You're live with Lucy Hockings on BBC World News. A stark warning ahead of Ukraine's Independence Day. The US says Russia plans to increase attacks on civilian buildings. Wednesday also marks 6 months since Russian troops invaded.
People were advised by the Ukrainian government, it's not an order, but the advice to stay away from military targets, government installations, or even outside Kyiv.
Ukraine says it has nothing to do with the killing of a Russian ultranationalist, Daria Dugina, as a memorial is held for her in Moscow. Najib Razak will be the first former Prime Minister of Malaysia to go to jail after losing his appeal for corruption on a massive scale. Lebanon grain silos damaged in a major blast in 2020 in Beirut collapse after weeks of fires. And Jupiter, like we've never seen it before. New pictures from the James Webb Telescope reveal remarkable details. In the next half hour, we'll hear from our correspondents in Kyiv, Sydney, New York, and we'll be live in Bangkok. It has nearly been 6 months since Russia began its invasion of Ukraine, and the US has issued a stark warning that Moscow is planning to step up its attacks on civilian infrastructure and government facilities. The US State Department says its conclusion is based on information gathered by American intelligence agencies, which has now been declassified. All remaining American citizens in Ukraine are being urged to leave immediately. We've had these pictures through in the past few minutes or so from Kyiv today, and what you can see here, there's already a ban on public events which would have been held on Wednesday to commemorate independence from the Soviet Union. Well, let's bring you up to date with our correspondent in Kyiv, Hugo Bachega.
The warning from the State Department coming as American officials say they have information that Russia is likely to step up its efforts to attack civilian infrastructure, government facilities across the country in the next few days. And the US Embassy here in Kyiv has told US citizens to leave the country immediately. Now, this comes after President Zelensky said that Russia could be planning to do something disgusting, in his words, to mark Independence Day tomorrow. And tensions have been particularly high in the last few days after a string of explosions and attacks in Crimea, also the assassination of the political commentator Daria Dugina in Russia on the weekend. Now, a number of cities in Ukraine have taken some measures ahead of Independence Day. In the city of Kharkiv, which is a city in the east that's been under constant bombardment, a curfew has been extended. And here in the capital, Kyiv, away from the front lines, there is a ban on public events. The curfew hasn't been extended, but the city, like the rest of the country, is on high alert.
Alexei Melnik is the co-director at the Razumkov Center think tank and a former Ukrainian Air Force officer. He told me what effect this warning from the US was having on people there.
This is a permanent threat of the Russian attacks. It's like daily and every night. And I should say that almost 70% of the Russian cruise missiles actually hit civilian targets or infrastructure. That's why we are quite prepared mentally, and also people were advised by the Ukrainian government, it's not an order, but the advice to stay away from military targets, government installations, or even outside Kyiv. It's not an order, it's an advice. And this morning I traveled from my apartment to my office in downtown, so I haven't seen anything unusual, any extra security measures.
So then, Alexei, what are the expectations in Ukraine about what could possibly happen tomorrow? What sort of attacks are people expecting?
We don't expect actually anything new because we've been through this terrible experience for 6 months already, and people react differently. Some people quite careful, they follow the warnings, but some people especially young people, care less. They sit, may sit and drink coffee. But I mean, as I said, it's just kind of new normal for us.
How valuable is this kind of intelligence that we're hearing from the US?
As a matter of fact, we have pretty good Ukrainian military intelligence, and there is a high level of cooperation with the US intelligence. Of course, they don't provide the whole information, but at least the bits they provide actually confirm the same expectations, the same conclusions that we have from our Ukrainian sources.
Alexei, how are you feeling about tomorrow, about Independence Day, and what it means 6 months on now?
Yeah, it's exactly 6 months in the Russian attack, and we feel, of course, if you put aside all the terrible feeling of being in a country of war. I've been to many war places as a former military, but it's another matter when you have war at home. But in general, we recently have published our public opinion surveys, and like 90% of Ukrainians are pretty confident that Ukraine will defeat Russia. And the people mostly optimistic about our future. So it just kind of encouragement for us, for all of us.
So that's interesting, Alexei, that people are planning and looking ahead into the future. It's not just a situation now of trying to get through every day. It felt very much like that a few months ago.
Yeah, that's exactly what keeps us alive and what gives us hope and strength to fight.
In Moscow, a memorial service has been held for Daria Dugina, who was killed in a car bombing at the weekend. She's the daughter of a prominent supporter of Vladimir Putin, and Russian officials have accused what they call Ukrainian terrorists of being behind the attack. Ms. Dugina, who was 29, died when her vehicle exploded. Her prominent ultranationalist father, Alexander Dugin, you can see him here at today's service, may have been the intended target of the attack, but Ukraine says it had no involvement in the incident. Much more on all the developments in the war on Ukraine on our website, including this look at the reactions of both sides to the killing of Daria Dugina. Log on to bbc.com/news. Don't forget as well, you can access the news on our app. Donald Trump has asked a judge to freeze the Justice Department's investigations of files seized from his home in Mar-a-Lago earlier this month. The FBI says it took 11 sets of classified documents during the raid on the 8th of August. Mr. Trump says all of the files were declassified, and he is now asking for an independent lawyer to oversee the investigation, which could limit the scope of any proceedings against him. In their legal filing, Donald Trump's team made it clear he thinks the whole episode is politically motivated. They said the FBI was just looking to support efforts to thwart President Trump from running again. They add that Mr. Trump is the clear front-runner in the 2024 Republican presidential primary and in the 2024 general election, although the statement adds a caveat, should he decide to run. And it accuses law enforcement on this occasion of being used as a weapon for political purposes. So is Mr. Trump the victim of an organised campaign against him, or someone whose approach to power was at best careless and at worst criminal? CBS News correspondent Bradley Blackburn sent us this update from New York.
A special master would slow this process down. It would be an independent person that would review these documents, and it just adds another step to this process. As the Department of Justice continues their investigation, it is not clear that they believe that they've recovered all of the classified materials from former President Trump's Mar-a-Lago home. This morning, the New York Times is reporting that all told, federal authorities have recovered 300 documents from Mar-a-Lago that were classified. Some of those documents marked top secret. That's the highest level of protection for documents in the U.S. government. These are kinds of documents that would typically have to be reviewed at a secure facility. When President Trump was in office, there was a facility built at Mar-a-Lago to review those types of documents. Of course, it was removed after he left office. The Republicans are rushing to his defense in the wake of this FBI search. The question is whether that continues as we learn more information about the documents that the government recovered and the nature of those documents. It's not clear at this point. But one interesting point in the legal filing yesterday from the Trump team, they asserted that President Trump is the front runner for the Republican presidential nomination in 2024. Now, he's not officially declared his candidacy, but it just shows how politics are so intertwined with this investigation.
Let's take you now to Dallas in Texas, where at least one person has been killed. Dozens more needed rescuing after record-breaking rainfall. A 60-year-old woman died when her vehicle was swept away by floodwaters. A state of disaster has been declared after more than 48 centimetres of rain fell in just 24 hours in one area of the city. Elon Musk is taking legal action to force the co-founder of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, to appear in court as part of his legal battle against the company. Mr. Musk wants to cancel his $44 billion deal to buy Twitter. He says it misled him on a number of fake accounts. Twitter denies the claims and wants the sale to go ahead. Firefighters in Madrid had a rather unusual problem to solve when this stolen car was left on a metro platform. They had to use, as you can see, winches to haul it upstairs. They did eventually bring it back to the surface. Precise details, though, of how it came to be on the subway haven't yet been confirmed. No one, though, was hurt. The former Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak is beginning a 12-year prison sentence after failing in a final appeal against his conviction for corruption. He was escorted straight from the courtroom to jail for theft from a government investment fund known as 1MDB. Billions of dollars that were supposed to fuel economic growth in Malaysia were stolen in one of the world's biggest financial scandals. Let's go live to Bangkok. We can speak to our Southeast Asia correspondent, Jonathan Head. Jonathan, what a stunning downfall for Najib Razak, and also the first, I think, Malaysian leader to be sent to jail like this. How big a moment is this for Malaysia?
I think it's huge, particularly for those who sought a break with the sort of corrupt and cronyistic practices of the past. And of course, it was this scandal, 1MDB, and the public anger over it, which helped bring Mr. Najib down in an election 4 years ago and end his party, UMNO's 61-year monopoly on power, brought about by a wave of popular support for a new way of doing things. Now, since that election, Malaysian politics has got very messy. People, of course, have really struggled with COVID. And in fact, his party, UMNO, has made something of a comeback. And a lot of Malaysians have wondered whether such a powerful figure, and he was once untouchable, still very influential in his party, would actually go to prison. The Malaysian judiciary, though, has held very firm. These are decisive verdicts, both the original appeal against his sentence, which was heard at the end of last year, and this final Supreme Court appeal. In both of those, the judges said there was no reason to view anything as unsound in both the verdict and in the sentence. And Mr. Najib has fought tenaciously with his lawyers to try and stop, to win this appeal, and in fact to slow it down. In fact, at the very last minute, he even tried to get one of the Supreme Court judges disqualified. He's tried all sorts of tactics. Not a single one of them has worked. This was an absolutely unanimous verdict. And I think for those who believe that he should be held responsible for that huge scandal and for many other things as well, the fact that the sentence has been upheld will be very satisfying. There will be a caveat, though, which is if Mr. Najib's party, UMNO, does well in an election, which must be held within the next year, it is likely there'll be some kind of a push to get him a pardon. And so whether he actually serves those full 12 years is not clear. He does, of course, face many other charges in relation to that same 1MDB scandal.
Jonathan, this was one of the world's biggest financial scandals, and there are some quite remarkable details in there involving Hollywood movies and Van Gogh paintings. Remind us a bit more about the allegations.
Well, 1MDB was originally a little-known fund, which was expanded by Mr. Najib at the beginning of when he first became Prime Minister back in around 2008, 2009, in an attempt to get funds from around the world that was supposed to be to help Malaysia develop, to invest in things like power stations that it was thought would be good for Malaysia in the long term, a bit like a sovereign wealth fund. But he allowed a very flamboyant young Malaysian businessman known as Jolo to direct a lot of those investments. They went through all sorts of complicated channels. Jolo was leading an extraordinarily extravagant life off the proceeds. He co-funded the Wall Street movie, The Wolf of Wall Street, had an incredible collections of art. He had an amazing sort of private yacht. All these revelations came out while Mr. Najib was still in power. And while he was in power, No investigations in Malaysia made any progress, but there were investigations in Switzerland and in the US, and eventually it all piled up and helped eventually drive Mr. Najib from power, and it seems now towards prison.
Good to see you, Jonathan. Thanks for joining us from Bangkok. You're live with Lucy Hockings. It's still to come. The James Webb Space Telescope reveals Jupiter's stunning details. I'll be speaking to a leading scientist at the UK Space Agency. And former Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison accused of fundamentally undermining democratic conventions. We'll bring you the latest from Sydney.
He's the first African-American to win the presidential nomination of a major party, and he accepts exactly 45 years ago to the day that Martin Luther King declared, "I have a dream."
As darkness falls tonight, an unfamiliar light will appear in the southeastern sky. An orange glowing disk that's brighter than anything save the moon, our neighbouring planet, Mars.
There is no doubt that this election is an important milestone in the birth of East Timor as the world's newest nation.
It'll take months and billions of dollars to repair what Katrina achieved in just hours.
3 weeks is the longest the great clock has been off duty in 117 years. So it was with great satisfaction that clockmaker John Vernon swung the pendulum to set the clock going again.
You're live with Lucy Hockings. A senior legal official in Australia says the decision of the former Prime Minister Scott Morrison to give himself secretly extra powers while in office fundamentally undermined democratic conventions. But he stopped short of breaking the law. Mr. Morrison has said he needed to take more responsibility during the COVID pandemic. Critics say he was just brazenly grabbing power. His successor, Anthony Albanese, had this comment.
So we will make a future announcement about an inquiry. I'm giving notice today that inquiry will take place. This isn't something that can be just dismissed. This is something that goes to our very system of government, which the Solicitor General's advice makes very clear.
Critics say it was a power grab. What has Scott Morrison had to say? Here's Phil Mercer.
Well, we heard from Scott Morrison a few days ago, and he said that he had to assume these emergency powers to use in what he described as extreme situations for the national interest. Now, all of this took place in 2020 and 2021 during the height of the pandemic in Australia, where Mr. Morrison secretly appointed himself to 5 key ministerial portfolios, among them Home Affairs and Treasury. And today we heard from the Solicitor General. He is the second most important law officer in the country, and he's been investigating the legality of Mr. Morrison's actions. And the upshot is essentially Mr. Morrison, the former PM, has been found not guilty of breaking any laws or breaching the Constitution, but he is being blamed for a fundamental undermining of Australia's responsible government. And to have an accusation levelled against a former Prime Minister is a fairly monumental chapter in Australian politics.
And Phil, what seems remarkable as well is that many of the government ministers and charges of those departments didn't even know that he'd put himself in charge as well with them, which seems to have implications for the entire parliamentary system in Australia. Will there now be some kind of inquiry into this?
We don't really know what motivated Scott Morrison here. As we say, Lucy, a week or so ago, we did hear from the man himself, and he attempted to explain, but I don't think he really got to the heart of the matter as to why he didn't tell anyone or tell too many people. So perhaps it was an instance where he really didn't trust his government colleagues. But what happens now? More pressure will be heaped upon the shoulders of Scott Morrison. Remember, he's still an MP. He's an opposition MP in federal parliament, and there will now be a formal investigation into his actions. We don't know who will be in charge of that inquiry, but it's likely to be a former judge, and he or she will have to answer some pretty big questions. How and why was Scott Morrison able to get away with this, and what can be done to stop it happening in the future? Because the present Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, made a very salient point. He said that it is fundamental that the Australian public have absolute confidence in their political process. And Mr Albanese believes that confidence has been shaken by the Morrison affair.
Germany is scrambling to save energy after Russia cut its supply of gas, and that is reopening an old and rather controversial debate. Most of the country's motorways famously have no speed limit. Some experts, though, say slowing drivers down could actually save energy. The idea, though, of closing off the fast lane is proving controversial, as Jenny Hill now reports.
It's practically a national pastime, indulging a passion for speed, even if it's in miniature. But as Germany hurtles towards winter, an energy crisis looms, and calls for a speed limit on its motorways are gaining traction.
It doesn't make any sense. With the current petrol prices, no one goes full throttle on the motorway. Everyone's going slower. Trying to save even more energy by imposing rules wouldn't work.
A speed limit is long overdue, but in reality you can't go much faster anyway.
Germany's motorways are world famous. There is technically nothing to stop a driver doing, as one did recently, more than 400 kilometres an hour. But would slowing them down significantly reduce fuel consumption? In the drive to conserve energy, this economist believes every little helps.
It could save some 1.5% of the consumption of fuel. At least if we would limit it or introduce a speed limit for a certain period of time. I think we should be carefully about introducing it forever, eternally, but for a certain time, as long as the crisis prevails, why not?
A motorway speed limit would please environmental campaigners and those who worry about safety, although significantly more people die on Germany's rural roads than the Autobahn. This debate has been raging on and off for years, and it's extremely contentious. This, after all, is the land of rules and regulations, of bureaucracy. So for many, it's about so much more than the open road. It's about freedom. And for Germany's liberal politicians, that right is sacrosanct, though the rest of the coalition government disagrees.
Well, where's the stop then? If you say, well, speed limit 130 kilometers per hour, then the next person comes and says, well, it's 100 kilometers per hour would be even better. The next one comes and says, well, 60 would be even better. And the next person comes and says, well, not driving a car at all would be the best.
It's a long-running and intense debate, but public opinion has now shifted in favour of a limit. Could this be the moment the battle for Germany's motorways is finally won? Jenny Hill, BBC News, Berlin.
The world's largest and most powerful space telescope has revealed unprecedented views of Jupiter. The James Webb Telescope took the pictures of the solar system's biggest planet in July, and the images show the storms, moons and rings surrounding Jupiter in detail that astronomers have described as incredible. So let's join now Caroline Harper, who is the head of space science at the UK Space Agency. She joins me from Swindon in southeast England. Caroline, when I saw these images, I thought how stunning they were. But I wonder for you, when this is your passion, what your reaction was when you saw these incredible pictures from Jupiter, of Jupiter.
Hi, Lucy. Well, they're beautiful, aren't they? They're not just scientifically incredibly interesting, that they're fantastic to look at. It's just unprecedented, the level of detail and the clarity of these images compared with what we've had before.
Is there a sense of surprise then, Caroline, at just how good these pictures are?
I think so, yes. I think, to be honest, it's fair to say some of these images have pretty much knocked the socks off some of the scientists. They're all saying James Webb is performing even better than expected, which is brilliant news.
Tell us what we're seeing, Caroline, when we see these sort of close-up, detailed pictures of Jupiter. What's been revealed?
Well, so what we're looking at is composite images taken with one of the instruments on James Webb, the NIRCam instrument. And what we're looking at has been artificially coloured because James Webb uses infrared light to observe the universe and in this case to observe Jupiter. So it's been artificially coloured. And if you look at the images that we can see that the sort of the white areas are areas that are reflecting a lot of light. So probably the tops of high clouds. So you will see the famous red spot on Jupiter, which in these images looks white.
So that's
it's reflecting a lot of light.
Sorry to interrupt you, Caroline. That's what we're seeing now. We just saw that image. This is the great red spot. Now it's famous, this storm. Is it right? It's so big it could swallow Earth.
That's correct. Yes, it is. Jupiter is much bigger than Earth, and the diameter of that storm, yes, it could swallow Earth.
What are your expectations now of the telescope? Because it keeps delivering. What next?
Well, so James Webb was originally conceived to look far back in time at the earliest stars to see the faint light that comes from the very first stars in the universe as they were forming. And you need infrared light to be able to see the light from these stars because the universe is expanding. So as the light travels a long distance, it gets stretched into longer wavelengths, which sit in the infrared spectrum. So you need a telescope like James Webb to be able to capture that really faint infrared light from the earliest stars in the universe. So this is really looking back much further in time than we've been able to do before to the earliest stars. And the other thing about James Webb is the infrared light lets it peer inside dust clouds that always surround star nurseries and baby planets forming. There's always a lot of thick dust. And the Hubble Space Telescope, which has been sending back amazing images for the past 30 years, it's brilliant, but it uses visible light, and that has its limitations. It can't see through these dust clouds, and James Webb can.
That's so exciting, Caroline, and thank you so much for explaining all of that so clearly to us and with such great passion. We can't wait to see what the telescope, the James Webb Space Telescope, delivers next. See you again in a few minutes' time.
Hello, really hot weather is set to continue across the eastern side of Europe over the next few days with temperatures well above the norm for the time of year. It is also turning quite hot down to the southwest. Clear skies on this earlier satellite picture across Spain and Portugal up into France. Heat wafting its way northwards as well. So a pretty hot afternoon actually on Tuesday across many of these western parts and out towards the east. And then we've got this zone of thunderstorms stretching through the Baltic, down through Poland and most especially across the Balkans. Some quite intense thundery downpours which could give a lot of rain in a short space of time. Some of those just fringing into central parts of Italy. Could you see the odd afternoon thunderstorm popping up across parts of Spain, especially up over high ground in the north. A bit more cloud rolling into the western side of France, but temperatures there in Paris getting up into the high 20s, maybe up to 30 degrees, 31 the high in Moscow. And as the sun continues to beat down here on Wednesday, we're going to see similar temperatures once again. Still this stripe of thunderstorms not moving very far. Still some quite high temperatures out west as well. 32 in Paris, London, likely to get into the high 20s Celsius. It will gradually cool down a little bit here as we head through into the weekend, cooling off a touch in Paris. Lots of hot sunshine continuing there in Rome. Temperatures around 30 degrees. The increasing chance of catching a shower in Berlin and some showers for the next few days in Athens.
Now showing on BBC Real.
On this hill in southern Germany, overlooking the city of Darmstadt, lie the ruins of a medieval castle with a suggestive name.
Welcome to the castle Frankenstein. A lot of people think the monster, the creature of Mary Shelley's story has to do with the castle.
The last resident of the castle, who lived here in the 1700s, might be the culprit for that. The theologian, physician and alchemist Conrad Diepel.
He made a paste of animals' bodies and he smeared this paste on bodies in the hope of bringing them to life. But alas, this was all a complete failure. But we are left with a strong possibility that this strange little castle could have given her the name for Victor Frankenstein.
Watch more stories like this at bbc.com/real.
It's 6 months into the war in Ukraine, and these Russian armoured vehicles and tanks are displayed in Kyiv as a reminder of the threat this country faces. I'm James Waterhouse, and as we see more intense fighting in the south, follow us on BBC World News for all the latest updates in this conflict.
The momentum behind women's sport is at fever pitch after England win the European Football Cup. But are the dollars finally flowing in to level the playing field? I find out from the head of Women's Super League and the boss of US Ski and Snowboard. Join me, Aaron Heselhurst, on Talking Business Weekly, here on BBC World News.
I've got turkey teeth and I'm proud of it.
Brits are flocking to places like Turkey in the pursuit of perfect pearly whites.
I'm happy with my teeth. Yeah, I'm really happy with them.
But is an award-winning smile worth the risk?
They're filed down so much, my teeth are gone.
Turkey teeth, bargain smiles or big mistake. On BBC World News.
Hello, I'm Ross Atkins with Outside Source. This is the extraordinary story of climate change. Vaccines for Ukraine. Let's look at some of the international reaction. Tell us what you've been hearing. In practical terms, what does that mean? And let's just remind ourselves, this is all part of the same story.
Piece the story together with Ross Atkins. Outside Source on BBC World News.
You're live with Lucy Hockings on BBC World News. A stark warning ahead of Ukraine's Independence Day. The US says Russia plans to increase attacks on civilian buildings. Wednesday will also mark 6 months since Russian troops invaded. Britain's intelligence agencies are facing accusations of colluding in the abduction and torture of a British national by the Indian authorities. Lebanon grain silos damaged in a major blast in 2020 in Beirut collapse after weeks of fires. And Usain Bolt submits an application to trademark a logo of his legendary victory pose. We'll explain why. Britain's intelligence agencies are facing accusations that they tipped off the Indian authorities about a British man who was later seized and allegedly tortured. Jagtar Singh Johal, a Sikh activist and blogger, was snatched off a street by Indian police 5 years ago and has been in prison ever since. India denies suggestions of torture. Mr. Johal's brother has been speaking to the BBC about the circumstances of his abduction.
Jagtar travelled